The acuity in the hybrid world, it's
yeah, with math, it's like I feel more than
a letter
normally you would be smaller table, somehow table,
or do whatever you want.
front of the table, chair in the back, crazy to see it. Down and that's like the side of it. Like we don't have like first dad and Stevie.
or
they just don't, you know, I've never seen them. Like,
I walked past my brand colleagues several times before realizing that my colleagues virtual and like masks.
They seem to there's a part of it that's
I'm so sorry.
where
One way to get welcome to the department.
it's kind of like a bubble or
we also hired. We have
it's relative to
so in that sense, reason why
somebody like
I'm doing it right yeah, I mean, so actually, the department had another but all the fact it's a visually defined center. And then all of it. That's true. You don't academic. I do appreciate it. And one of the things about there is there's a lot of things covered. You notice right now a lot of actually this probably when I came into I like CSAC.
Yeah.
No tax, less like. I know it's been around. I'm trying to find out. Like I think I really program. I don't know if they actually cover that. That's what I'm figuring out. It's not very like. You guys the only so they might like and like a couple things from industry. See that? So how I think remember research is all run after me. It's great. Alex was
Oh, that's a fun group.
like sort of and as soon as we were there, we all started the second.
Yeah, so I just finished up this. I mean, yes, interesting. A little bit frustrating, but it's times a lot frustrating. It's a very big project. With I enjoyed the
Or you can look at my screen or but not that screen. But yeah, that was required.
how much money would it save? Stability. So he's really sorry.
No, no worries. I saw the email there.
We had a couple.
No problem.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the MIT SSP Wednesday Seminar. I'm Taylor Fravel, director of the program, and delighted to welcome Melissa Lee from Princeton University, where she's an assistant professor of politics and international affairs. She studies international and domestic politics of state building and state development, and is the author most recently of a book from Cornell University Press, Crippling Leviathan: How Foreign Subversion Weakens the State. Her research has been published in Terrific outlets, the American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, International Organization, the Annual Review of Political Science and Foreign Affairs. Her thesis won APSA's Helen Dwight Reed Award, which is now the Mers Tate Award, the APSA's European Politics and Society Sections Best Article Prize, and the Perry House Emerging Scholar Global Prize. In the previous academic year, she was in residence at UPenn as a Lightning Scholar at Perry House, and very near and dear to my heart, she has a PhD from Stanford University, where she studied, I learned, with Steve Krasner, who is also a member of the faculty there, who I had a great pleasure of being able to work with. So welcome to MIT. We're really delighted to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Thanks everyone for being here. So today I am presenting a working paper co-authored with my colleagues, Nan Zhang, who went to Stanford with me and is now at the Mannheim Center for European Social Research, as well as a former Princeton undergrad, Tilman Herschenritter, who is currently in a gap year. Before I get started on this, telling you about this project, what I want to do is to put it in context of my larger research agenda. Many of you probably know me from my work on foreign subversion and how foreign subversion weakens the state. Most of my research is about the politics of state strength and state weakness, both from an international and a comparative perspective. And so Crippling Leviathan and some of my work about international state building is about the role of foreign actors in shaping state development. But an important strand of my work seeks to understand how today's strong states actually became strong. And so it explores different facets of stateness from a much more comparative and historical perspective. And this project, which is about state development and contestation over sovereignty in the United States context, really fits in that second bucket of work, the comparative and historical origins of today's strong states. Let's see this. Okay. It again? It was working when we tested it. All right, got it. So one of the most important developments in the history of state formation is the emergence of this idea of sovereignty, right? Or this notion that there exists a final political authority with the right to make and enforce binding rules. And while most people no longer dispute whether sovereignty should exist, whether authority should exist, what they do dispute is the configuration of sovereign authority. That is, where should sovereign authority be located and how should it be structured? Historically, violence played a role in settling these debates about the proper location and structure of sovereignty. And in wars over sovereignty, such as the English Civil War, for example, one vision of how sovereign authority is to be organized triumphed over an alternative and resulted in the institutionalization of the victor's vision of sovereignty. However, sovereignty requires more than institutions. It requires more than institutionalization, because it ultimately rests on the recognition and acceptance of the governed. Right? So an institutionalization does not automatically apply that ideational acceptance will be forthcoming. And so in other words, I think of sovereignty as both institutional and ideational, and it is something that exists when people think it exists. And so our paper explores how war shapes the popular imagination of sovereignty. And what we do in this paper is we develop three possible effects of how war may bring about this ideational shift. A first possibility is what we call the abandonment idea, in which the losers in war reconcile themselves to the winner's vision of sovereignty and ultimately accept that vision of sovereignty. A second possibility is what we call the valence or reinforcement hypothesis, in which the fighting for a particular vision or ideal of sovereignty causes both sides to harden their attachment to that ideational notion of sovereignty. And a third possibility is a much more, it emphasizes the effects of war on a subset of individuals that we call ideological entrepreneurs, who are then emboldened by the outbreak of violence and disruption to promote their own ideal of sovereignty much more vigorously. Now, we test the effects of war on imagined sovereignty in the context of 19th century America. And as we all know, 19th century America is a period of profound political and ideational transformation. This is a case where the contest between two competing visions of sovereignty erupted into the violence of the US Civil War. Now, the historical setting of our analysis gives us a very long period to observe ideational changes in the population. But one disadvantage of this site is that we lack public opinion data about how people actually think about sovereignty. And to circumvent this problem, what we do instead is we examine changes in the civic language as a proxy for how Americans think about the sovereignty of the United States. Since we can't get into their heads, we instead look at how they speak. And we use this change, which a particular grammatical change, in which the United States stops being a plural noun and starts becoming a singular noun as a proxy for changes in how people think about sovereignty. That is, we no longer think of the United States as being an entity of multiple equal sovereign states. Rather, we think of it as having a single sovereign authority. Now, we trace the evolution of this is our shift over the course of the 19th century, and we can show that there is a powerful Civil War effect. That is, the war does shape popular imaginations of sovereignty, but that it is really concentrated among this subset of individuals that we call the ideological entrepreneurs. And in this case, those individuals are the Northern Republicans. Okay. One of the things that I really like about this project is that this finding about the ideational component of sovereignty and the role of these ideological entrepreneurs in pursuing or pushing this change is that it really highlights the mismatch between the ideational aspects of sovereignty and the institutional aspects of sovereignty. Much of the state building scholarship that I engage with, and including my own work, has really focused on institutions, right? The institutions of sovereignty and the effect of war on the institutional development of the state. But again, institutions alone do not make a state. And the institutional changes that come about from war do not necessarily produce ideational change. And this is a contribution of this project that I want to return to in the conclusion. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that we developed three different hypotheses about how war may shape the imagination of sovereignty. But because of our novelty of our research question, these hypotheses are not directly drawn on a single canon of literature. That is, what we do instead is we take inspiration from three disparate literatures to formulate conjectures about the role of war. And so our first conjecture begins with this idea or this observation that war, or more properly, defeat on the battlefield, can settle the institutional question about the proper location and structure of sovereign authority. One side wins, one side loses, and the victors get to impose their institutions of sovereignty on the vanquished. And so given this reality, the losing side may then simply give up, right? Reconcile itself to the reality on the ground. And really, this idea comes from the logic of adaptive preferences, right? In which people tend to adjust their aspirations to their possibilities in life. And so we expect that when defeat makes some institutional arrangements impossible, ideological abandonment will follow. The second conjecture draws not on the literature on preferences, but really comes much more from the traditional state building literature and takes inspiration from Charles Tilley's observation that wars are really expensive in terms of blood and treasure, and that states have to rely on their populations to draw these resources in order to fight and sacrifice in times of war. But in doing so, as leaders are making these appeals for their citizens to fight and sacrifice in wartime, they have to justify why these wars are being fought, right? They have to explain why these wars are fought. They have to explain the issues under dispute and justify why sacrifice is needed. And they often make these justifications in terms of ideological appeals, right? These can be appeals toward democracy or national identity, patriotic appeals, religious appeals, but often they can apply to sovereign principles like the right to national self-determination. And these appeals can even take on normative valence, right? So as each side is going to position its position as the one that is morally right and correct. And so we expect that under this mechanism, which we call the valence mechanism, war is going to strengthen ideological commitment on both sides of the conflict. All right. The third conjecture builds on a different strand of literature, which really sees the disruption of war as an opportunity or a critical juncture for institutional or ideational change. Wars are, of course, highly visible, disruptive, traumatic events, right? We all know this. And for ordinary people, the uncertainty and shock of crisis, particularly these kinds of crisis, really disrupts the status quo. And it opens them up to conversion, to new ideas, and to new possibilities. And so knowing that these kind of moments are rare and often fleeting, ideological entrepreneurs, by which we mean the individuals who are most committed to promoting ideological change, will feel newly empowered, newly energized, and galvanized into action to seize the moment. And so here under this mechanism, which we're going to call the entrepreneurial mechanism, we expect increased ideological commitment, but really only among these ideological entrepreneurs. So again, I call this the entrepreneurial hypothesis, but you could really think of it as sort of the carpe diem or YOLO hypothesis. So what we do is that we're going to examine these three hypotheses in the context of 19th century America. As I mentioned earlier, we really like this case because it features two clear competing ideas about how sovereign authority should be arranged, and that these ideas were really in tension from the very moment of the US founding, right? So that is at the moment that we established our independence and set up our institutions, there was disagreement about whether we would be a truly federal entity or a truly national entity. And to quote one historian, the United States was neither wholly federal nor wholly national at its founding. Now, these debates about final sovereign authority and where it should be located in the states or in the federal government or the national government arose periodically through the first several decades of our nation's existence. And as we all know, North-South divisions over slavery really intensified this debate about sovereignty. In particular, the Southern slaveholding states justified their position on slavery and its eventual secession from the Union by arguing that the Union was a compact of equal sovereign states. Right? So they had this notion of a delegated kind of sovereignty. So sovereignty originates with the US states. The states delegate that sovereignty to the national government. And because the Union only exists as an agreement that comes about from this delegated sovereignty, that authority can be withdrawn at any time. In contrast, the northern states had a much more organic and national conception of sovereignty. And so whereas the South thought of sovereignty as this composite thing, the North thought of the national government as possessing a consolidated sovereignty, that there is no sovereignty that pre-existed the Union, and the states only had to share authority because it comes from the national government. And these ideas are particularly pronounced among members of the northern wing of the Republican Party, as well as their Whig predecessors. Now, the Civil War did settle these questions in an institutional sense, right? The South seceded, it ends up defeated, the North fought back. But the question that we're really exploring in this particular case is whether the war actually promoted that ideational shift. And so now that you have the historical background, I want to take those three different hypotheses I introduced and develop very case-specific hypotheses. And they're summarized here in this table. So what you can see is that the different hypotheses vary not only in terms of the mechanism, but in the timing of when we should expect to observe the effects, either post-war or at the outbreak of war, and they also differ in terms of where we should expect to see the effects and the direction of the effects, right? So the abandonment hypothesis is the one that emphasizes defeat on the battlefield. So we should really see a change among the South, right, the losers, as they move away from this sort of states' rights composite ideal of sovereignty and embrace a national sovereignty. For the valence mechanism, we develop both a strong version and a weak version of that mechanism. The reason we have to do this is because there's considerable disagreement among historians about what the South was really fighting about. I would say that, so I'm not a historian, but in my read of the history, there is a wing of historians who really see the war, the Civil War, as a fight about slavery. So primarily about slavery in the South, and only secondarily about states' rights. There is a different set of historians who emphasize the duality of these two competing ideas more equally, right? And so rather than take a stand on which set of historians is correct, we developed two different versions. In both versions, we should expect the North if the valence mechanism is at work, we should expect increased ideological commitment among the North. But we also develop a version that acknowledges the possibility that the South really wasn't initially fighting, at least initially fighting for states' rights. And so the strongest version of this valence hypothesis would also include ideological hardening among the South. Right? So we're going to test both the strong version and the weak version, which allows us to not take a position on which set of historians is correct. The final version is the entrepreneurial hypothesis. We expect to observe changes in the imagination of sovereignty at the outbreak of war. But instead of taking on sort of a sectional or regional comparison, here we're going to focus on the subset of actors who are the ideological entrepreneurs, again, the Northern Republicans. Now, although the historical setting of the United States gives us about 100 years to observe the ideational shift, potential ideational shift, as I mentioned, one of the problems that we had to surmount was the lack of data on how people are thinking about sovereignty, right? So because there's no public opinion data, we had to come up with another method. And so what we do is that we study changes in the civic language and in American English as a window into imagined sovereignty. And the basic idea here is that how people speak can tell us something about what they think. And specifically, as I mentioned, our measure is going to exploit a grammatical shift. It's a quirk of American English in which the phrase United States stopped being plural and started being singular. And we're going to take the shift as indicative of imagined sovereignty, where the plural, United States are, corresponds to this idea of a composite, multiple equal sovereignties embedded in the states, and where the singular corresponds to the idea that there is a single sovereignty embedded in the national government. Now, we are, of course, not the very first scholars to document this shift. This is well known among both historians and literary scholars, as well as specialists in American history. But these scholars have generally agreed that this grammatical shift does carry historical meaning. And then they have associated it with changes in how people think about the United States, whether it is singular or multiple, whether it is a union or a nation. So we're going to rely a bit on appeals to authority here. But we also know that observers in the 19th century themselves linked grammar to ideas about sovereignty, right? And in the paper, we have several pieces of primary source evidence that support this point. And one of them I actually want to read you in full. One of these quotes comes to us from the Washington Post, which is writing about a couple of decades after the Civil War, and it was trying to justify to its readers why it had changed to use the singular version of the United States. And so the quote, what they write is that before the first Bull Run, we generally said the United States are a confederacy, for instance. But after Appomattox, we learned to say the United States is a nation, for instance. The war settled permanently the question of grammar, and all that implies, because behind the sentiment was the syntax. Whatever we may have thought once, however we may have felt once, it is now seen to be better for us to all say the United States is a nation. And there are several quotes similar like this in the historical record. So we do think that observers living at the time thought of the United States in these kind of terms, that how you chose to speak really reflects what you think. And perhaps most importantly, just to give us some extra convincing on the conceptual validity of our measure, we went to see how individuals spoke about the Confederacy, right? The Confederacy founded on this idea of multiple equal sovereignties among the constituent parts. And importantly, in the primary source materials, the Confederacy is always treated as a plural noun. And so this grammatical shift is not some bizarre quirk of American English more generally in talking about federal type units. It is specific to the United States as a term. Okay. And I can talk more about this if you're interested. Now, we trace this grammatical shift in two types of textual sources. The first comes from two newspaper data sets. Both are proprietary digitized newspapers, corpuses. They cover the entire 19th century, from 1800 to 1899. What we like about these sources is that they contain political and non-political content from, I don't want to say non-elite, but I will definitely say less elite writers, right? So we think this gets us something closer to a truly popular imagination of sovereignty. And it does cover this entire period in which the grammatical shift is underway. What we can do here is use newspapers to pinpoint grammatical shift, the grammatical usage of the singular versus plural, to specific locations based on the newspaper's headquarters cities. To do that, we have to assume that the content in those newspapers is locally generated. That assumption is violated for most news articles, or many news articles, I should say, because newspapers had a practice of reprinting article content from other locations. And so to get around that, we're going to focus only on material that is likely to actually be locally generated, which are letters to the editor, as well as editorials. The second textual source comes to us from Congressional Speech. And so when members of Congress during this period weren't beating each other up on the floor of Congress, they were giving speeches and debating various issues. The Congressional Speech corpus comes from the two journals of Congress, the Congressional Globe and the Congressional Record, which contain all debates from Congress. And with the speech data, let us link grammatical usage in the plural or the singular to specific individuals, specific members of Congress. And that's going to let us pull in party ID information, which is really key for testing that entrepreneurial hypothesis. Now, an important assumption of this set of sources is that the speech that's printed in the congressional journals is verbatim speech, right? It is the speech of those speakers. This assumption is valid from about 1851 onward for a number of technological and policy-based reasons, which I can explain in Q&A if you're interested. But what it really means is that we're only observing speech from basically the latter half of the century. So what we get is a trade-off. We lose temporal breadth, but we get analytical depth, right, by being able to look at these individuals. Now, to identify the singular or plural, we follow scholarship in the humanities, and particularly the digital humanities, in using subject-verb agreement, right? So going all the way back to grade school, if the subject of a sentence is plural, then it has to take a plural verb, and if it's singular, it has to take a singular verb. And so we specifically look for three very common verb pairs: is, are, has, have, and was, were. But doing this search is not actually very straightforward. You can't just like go into a database and like type in United States are, United States is. And the reason is that we face two challenges. The first is that the United States has to occupy the subject position of a sentence. So I call this is called the grammatical subject. It can't be the object of a sentence, and it can't be some part of like a longer name such as President of the United States. In addition, because of the age of these documents, the OCR is in really bad shape, like really bad shape. This example is actually a pretty good case of bad OCR. And so what they show you are what this one shows you is an object mention. The commissioners who represented the United States are now dead, right? So that's an object mention, we can't use that. This one is meant to say, now the United States has not owned any land in that part of the state of Tennessee. And again, that's like pretty good. So the way we get around this, and credit to my co-author Tillman for really developing the method for this. He had a really low-tech automated solution that I can tell you about, which basically developed a series of rules to identify likely subject mentions as opposed to object mentions, throwing out very common problems like compound nouns, Mexico and the United States, for example. And then the poor guy read every single remaining mention to verify that we had no false positives. So lots of work. In follow-on work, we're developing a much more sophisticated natural language processing approach. The OCR is still a problem. But so I'm very confident that what we have here are actual grammatical subject mentions, even if it is not the whole universe. All right, so because two of the three of our hypotheses involve sectional effects, comparison between North and South, we're going to restrict attention to newspapers headquartered in US states and territories that eventually fought in the US Civil War. So that's blue and red states, right? Blue being the Union states, red being the states that eventually fought in the Civil War. We exclude 5 states, the ones shown in hash shading, because they are what's called the border states. They had the institution of slavery, but for whatever reason, usually quite specific to that state, did not join the Confederacy. And then for reasons of consistency, we're going to limit the speech data to members of Congress who represent those states and territories. So let me finally show you some data. So what this plot shows you is singular mentions, so grammatical subject mentions, from the newspaper corpus spanning the whole 19th century. It's separated out by North and South. The golden bar shows you the years of the US Civil War, and the size of these bubbles give you a sense of how many mentions we observe in each year. And if you're a little surprised about the magnitude, right, the rarity of these mentions, this is because the grammatical subject is actually not particularly common in this time period. It was not common to say, the United States went to war. Like now we think of that as very common. At the time that was not, it was less common than it is now. And that's actually something I'm picking up on in follow-on work. But what I want you to take away from this plot is that both the North and the South start with relatively low singular usage at the beginning of the century. And by the end of the century, we do see a massive increase for both sections. But what's going on between is super interesting, right? So what we appear to see in the North is an acceleration in the adoption of the grammatical singular, starting from around the time of the war. And for the South, it doesn't appear, maybe if we squint, it looks like an intercept shift, but it doesn't really look statistically significant. Right? So basically what I see is no change in the trend in the South, right? And so already this is suggesting that perhaps there's no evidence for the abandonment hypothesis. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that data to statistical analysis, testing the abandonment hypothesis together with the valence hypothesis in a single model. And what we do in that model is we're simply going to shift the year, sort of the breakpoint, because the timing of these two hypotheses differ, right? So in the first one, we're going to have the breakpoint at the end of the war. Second, we will have the breakpoint at the beginning of the war. The outcome of interest is change in the use of the grammatical singular. So this can be a change in levels, an intercept shift, or it can be a change in the rate adoption, which would be a slope shift. Okay. We specify a model of section, so like North, times a dummy for the period. So in the abandonment hypothesis, the period is set at post-1865, as well as year as a linear, entered as a linear term. The unit of analysis is the subject mention. And we're going to estimate this with linear probability with errors clustered at headquarters city, although it turns out the error clustering doesn't matter. We get about 5,000 mentions from a little under 5,000 unique documents. Of course, one of the complications of doing this kind of analysis is that we know there are a number of potential confounding factors that are related to section, as well as the likely usage of the grammatical singular. And so what we do is we draw inspiration from a lot of the comparative and American political development literature to come up with a set of confounding factors. And the most important confounding factors have to do with economic and political modernization, right? So scholars have long argued that modernization breaks local parochial ties and reorients individuals toward a larger national unit. In the American context, modernization often maps onto sectional differences related to local political economy, and also we're deeply bound up in the most contentious political issues of the day, which were the national tariff policy, as well as the role of the federal government in promoting what's called internal improvements, which really is physical infrastructure to connect the United States together. Now, these issues were also, they also engaged questions about the proper authority and sovereignty of the national government to override the individual state positions on these issues, right? They also pitted the nationally oriented Whigs and the Republican successors against the Democrats. And so to capture these confounding factors in this first analysis, we code several proxies for modernization at the county level. So these are going to be county characteristics that are associated with the grammatical subject mention. So think of it this way. So if if we have a mention from the Los Angeles Times, we're going to look at the county characteristics of Los Angeles County at the year in which that mention occurs. These county characteristics include the degree of urbanization, whether the county contains a river, a steamboat navigable river, whether it contains a canal. These are two really important types of internal improvements at the time, as well as a measure of terrain ruggedness to capture the accessibility of the region. And then the density of post offices. Why post offices? The post office is actually the entity of government that Americans are most likely to encounter in their everyday lives. So there's not much of a tax apparatus at this time. Most Americans aren't encountering the military. What they do see is the post office. Okay, so we're going to use that as a proxy for state presence and sort of exposure to sort of more modern political conditions. Okay, so let me show you the results. So ordinarily what I would do is I would show you a visual depiction. But in the interest of transparency and because there are a lot of comparisons that we're making, I thought a table would be clearer. Okay, what this table shows you is not the raw regression output. It actually shows you the linear combinations for the quantities of interest. And I want to focus your attention really on the second and the fourth lines of the table. It's always going to be the second and the fourth lines. These correspond to changes in levels, so the intercept shift, and the change in the rate of adoption or the slope shift. Okay. Now recall that the abandonment hypothesis focuses on the South. That's why we're just showing you the Southern results now. And that it holds that the South should increase singular usage after defeat. That is not what we're seeing here, right? There's no statistically significant evidence for that. And that really confirms what you saw in that plot that I showed you before. So again, I think this really cast doubt on the abandonment hypothesis. Now let me show you the results for the valence hypothesis. Same structure, sort of that triple interaction, but this time setting the time break at the beginning of the war. And here, I think we have some mixed evidence, right? So the strong version predicts we should see ideological hardening on both sides. The weak version makes predictions only for the North. And you want to focus on 2 and 4, 2 and 4, right? So not seeing, again, much evidence for the South, no evidence of any change. But in the North, right, we're seeing what looked like, again, confirming what our eyes saw in the plot, that there's an acceleration in the usage of the singular in the North. Okay, so where does that leave us so far? What we confidently can rule out is the abandonment hypothesis. But we can't rule out the valence hypothesis just yet because our evidence from the previous analysis, which is conducted only, which doesn't distinguish between within section heterogeneity, that evidence could be consistent with the entrepreneurial hypothesis. And so to test that, we have to move to the congressional speech data. To distinguish between the weak version of the valence hypothesis and the entrepreneurial hypothesis, we only look at within North variation. So both make predictions about patterns within the North. The weak version of the valence hypothesis would suggest that we wouldn't see heterogeneity by political party, right? Because this is a sectional effect, ideological hardening on one side. The entrepreneurial hypothesis does make a prediction about within section heterogeneity. Again, it should only be the Northern Republicans, the ones who are really pushing this idea of a strong, authoritative national government that can override the interests of the states. Those included the radical Republicans, two of the most famous of which are depicted on the slide. But the radical Republicans weren't the only ones pushing this idea, right? It really was the Republican Party more generally. And so if the entrepreneurial mechanism is in play, we should see greater wartime-induced shifts in the grammatical singular, sort of increases in the grammatical singular for the Republicans than their Democratic opponents in the North. So move to the speech data. Again, the outcomes of interest are changes in levels and rates of adoption, a triple interaction again, but this time between period, year, and a dummy for whether the speaker is a Republican or a Whig. Because of the complex structure of the data, we have to specify a hierarchical linear probability model, right? Because mentions are nested within speakers who can appear in more than one Congress. So we're going to include some cross-nested random effects We have fewer mentions, not surprising because this is a half century less of data. Our main inferential challenge that we face is that there is significant entry and exit of speakers from our data set. An entry and exit can occur because of the normal process of congressional turnover, but also because a speaker simply does not provide a mention in which the United States appears in that grammatical subject position, right? And so you might worry that these speakers cannot be pulled together. And so to get around that, what we're going to do is we're going to control for the life experiences of these speakers, because the life experiences, their social milieu might structure whether or not they decide to use the grammatical singular. These are broken down into two types of control variables: birthplace characteristics, which are coded at the county of birth, at the time of birth for each speaker, same set of controls as in the newspaper data set, as well as a set of indicators for a speaker's biographical experiences, whether he was college educated, whether he served in the US military, so not the Confederate military, and the year of birth, okay? So the structure of the table should be familiar. So again, 2 and 4, I'm going to go right to the punchline. The key to disentangling these two hypotheses from each other is that within section heterogeneity, and that's what we see, right? For Whigs and Republicans, there's a one-time discontinuous jump in singular usage. It's about almost 25% at the outbreak of war, but there's no such change for the Northern Democrats, right? So this is consistent with the entrepreneurial hypothesis, not the valence hypothesis. Now, skeptics might say, well, you've only got 10 years of data before the outbreak of war. So can we really be confident about that? To complete the empirical picture, we're going to go back to newspaper data just to make sure that this effect that we've seen exists there as well. There are some trade-offs here, right? We don't get party ID anymore, but what we can observe is whether a county voted for or was more influenced by Republicans than by Northern Democrats. So what we do is we look at how the counties voted in an important election, the 1864 election, which was contested between Abraham Lincoln, the Republican incumbent, and his Democratic challenger, George McClellan. And basically the idea here is that the counties that went for Lincoln should show, these are the counties that are the followers of the Republicans, right? And so we should see greater adoption of the grammatical singular, sort of more rapid adoption in those places compared to the Northern Democrat counties that went for McClellan. So again, triple interaction. This time we're swapping out the indicator and having a new dummy for whether the county went for Lincoln in that 1864 election. The unit of analysis is the same. We go back to linear probability, fewer observations because we've thrown out all of the South, right? South can't vote because they're not in the Union. Let's go right to the punchline again. What we can see is that there is changes in the slope for both Lincoln and McClellan counties. But notice that the change is about twice as large for the Lincoln counties as opposed to the Democratic counties. And so we do see this as evidence consistent with the entrepreneurial hypothesis when taken together in the totality of everything else that we have done in this paper. So what have we learned? So we found that warships imagine sovereignty, but for the North only, and more precisely, really for these ideological entrepreneurs, the places that are the individuals that are most committed to the national sovereignty idea, and the places that follow these individuals. This is a really important finding, we think, because it forces scholars to recenter the study of sovereign authority around its ideational foundations, right? Again, to go back to what I said in the beginning, sovereign authority requires much more than institutionalization for the effective exercise of power. And institutions have received a lot of attention at the expense of these more ideational components. Our study is pointing to this mismatch between institutions and the ideational foundations. Because sovereignty fundamentally rests on the recognition from the governed, our results imply that victory on the battlefield doesn't necessarily or automatically get you that recognition. So another important finding of our paper is that these ideological entrepreneurs really play an important role in mediating that shift, right? This suggests that scholars who want to understand the transformative effects of war on aspects of statehood have to be attentive of the question of for whom are these changes occurring, right? And not make, not draw conclusions about sort of entities as a whole. And really by focusing on these ideological entrepreneurs, our paper shows that scholars have to go beyond the dichotomy between the victors and the vanquished, right? And to recognize that even the victors may not be monoliths. And so for this reason, we think our paper has sober implications for post-war governance and national solidarity after the aftermath of crisis, right? When the vanquished don't recognize the authority of the victors or accept their vision, the victors are going to struggle to govern the vanquished, right? This is a lesson that's all too familiar to students of American history. The Southern backlash against Reconstruction left the transformative revolutionary project of the North really incomplete. And once the South was restored to the Union, Southern Democrats overwhelmingly sent large numbers of unrepentant former Confederates to the US Congress. And so to the extent that the Civil War did render the many into the one, this is true, at least in the short term, only in an institutional sense. And it would take several more decades for the United States to truly become one in the popular imagination. So thanks very much. I look forward to your comments.
Melissa, so folks on Zoom, just a reminder, we'll be able to include you if you want to jump in on the conversation. Everyone else, please hold up your hands. Nick, I saw you first. And Sam, anyone else? Go ahead, Nick. And please come up to the microphone.
Hi, Melissa. I'm Nick Ackert. I'm a third-year PhD student with the program. I'm also a huge fan of your work on Southeast Asia, and I also study weak states in that region. So I had a question. I think, and it's a big picture question, I find the evidence for the third hypothesis very persuasive given the extent of the data that you've collected. But what I can't get out of my mind is your previous work, which would tell me that actually for the cases of weak states, things like abandonment and valence, to me, would be much more plausible explanations for who gets to hold the monopoly on violence in a state. And I'm thinking of the case like Myanmar, right, which we call Myanmar because that's what the junta wants it called rather than Burma. And so if the core research question is how do strong states become strong, what I'm wondering is there already a cutoff where these states have strong enough institutions that policy entrepreneurs can already promote these ideas? And could that explain why we're not seeing this same kind of hypothesis active in the more developing world? And so if that's the case, does that tell us that there's some kind of a cutoff or an important scope condition for the theory you're proposing? Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah.
I was actually puzzling over this last night as I was reviewing the paper. I think about, state that history is written by the victor, and that's Myanmar is an excellent example of that. And yet the narrative about what the South faced, right, was the emergence of an idea of a myth of a lost cause. Like the Southern struggle was noble and all of these weird ideas that were around. I think doesn't quite fit with this notion of victor's justice. My mistake was actually not to go to this notion of a state strength cutoff, but to think about the particular regime context. Right, so we're democratic. These electorally democratic from our founding, and I sort of wonder if the fact that we started as a democracy, and so we start with this idea that there has to be voice and representation, even among the South, even after what they did by seceding from the United States, I think allowed for this other narrative to emerge that would not be possible, say, in a more authoritarian context like Myanmar. So I don't have strong priors that there could be a state strength cutoff. And so I would, if you had me down today, I would say it might have to be.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
That was really helpful.
Great, thanks. I'm gonna go to the Zoom now. Suzanne Freeman, over to you.
Hi, thanks so much. And thank you for a really interesting talk. My question is sort of about the implications of what you found in the US case and sort of generalizing to other civil wars. And I'm curious, and you sort of mentioned Reconstruction and some of the lack of success of Reconstruction at the end of your talk. And I'm curious what implications you think that this finding about entrepreneurs might have sort of for post-war settlements and their success and reintegrating losers into new states, and sort of for Civil War recurrence based on that. Thank you so much.
We think that in terms of generalizing to other wars, we do think these have to be wars in which there's some kind of contestation over ideas, right? So we're specifically studying the case of sovereignty because of the nature of my own research interests. But we do think that there are parallels to be drawn in to wars fought over other ideas, regime type, for example, or struggles for national groups. In terms of post-war settlements, I do think that our work suggests there has to be a distinction drawn between how you deal with the equivalent of an ideological, versus sort of what you might think of much more the rank and file or the foot soldiers, right? And that it will be much harder, I think, to incorporate the most ideologically as opposed to the rank and file. I don't want to go any further and say there's like what policy implications that might have, but I do think that this points to the very different treatment of those two groups. Maybe that's elites versus masses, but I do think it's something about the most committed versus sort of rank.
Thanks. So sticking on the Zoom, over to Rich Nielsen.
Hey, thanks for presenting this. I always love something texty, and great to see you again. A couple of comments to maybe think about things you might do in the paper, and then a question kind of more in the spirit of the SSP seminar of like a little bigger picture. The comments are, I think this could really benefit from like case studies of author fixed effects where like cascades of authors decide to change. Like you can show the date on which they stop using the plural and start using the singular and trace that out for a few people. And maybe even like, if you could show me like how the influence happens, all of a sudden the entrepreneurial story just becomes like rock solid. Also, I was just curious, like what other linguistic shifts would accompany this? So I could imagine taking texts where you see the shift and then doing something like topic models or something else on them to pick out other shifts that are correlated with this shift, because I imagine that there are other linguistic, either topical or kind of parts of speech in the changes that could co-occur, and that could be really interesting as well. So the more substantive question is, how much can you, what's your level of confidence that this is about war, or which part of the war is this about? So the shift doesn't happen super quickly. And I'm wondering what the entrepreneurs, if I go with your story, what exactly are they responding to? Are they responding to the fact that secession happened? And thus that requires a need to like create an ideology where the United States is singular? Is it because the war is concluded and won in a certain way? Or is it because it's concluded and then reunification is what happens? And so there's a need to try to, there's this political battle, that reminded me of like linguistic political battles that happen now about like, opposing Donald Trump or opposing Joe Biden, right? There's like all sorts of fun language games happening as we speak on trying to signal different political ideologies through phrases and phrases around loaded things. Which part do you think is most operative there? Or if you're not sure, like, is there something you could do that would hone in on like what exactly in the war is doing the work here? Because the treatment is bundled and the effects take a while to kick in.
So we would love to do something that looks at variation within authors. That's only possible in the speech data because we have no author information for this. For the speech data, we do have some congressmen that we can observe over long periods of time. And it does not, I'd say for the modal congressperson, it's not an automatic and immediate switch. It's not the case that for 1 year, he's using the singular, the plural, and then he suddenly stops. That's for the modal congressman. I think that's not true for the most radical of the Republicans, that they do stop pretty quickly. Using the plural if they used it at all before. Sorry, even the radicals were using it the plural before. But there's not a lot of data here using these super high tags. So we can actually like dig in and look at documents. We have not done that. I mean, like we can dig in and do a much more qualitative approach, and we have not done that yet. We're thinking about doing it. The question about other linguistic shifts is great. So historians have observed that we used to say union. We no longer say, it became much more common after the Civil War to say nation. We wanted to do that in our text analysis, but we couldn't quite the analog of the is-are. The nice thing about the is-are is that whenever the United States is in a grammatical subject position, you have to choose a verb, right? But you don't have to say union, you don't have to say nation. And we couldn't, I have to say, like, we couldn't come up with the right way to operationalize that without it turning it into some kind of salience measure. Right, so a salience measure being something kind of like what Google Ngrams would capture, like Google's usage. And so we stepped aside from that for now. We did do a very low tech topic modeling. It's like embarrassingly low tech for anyone who actually does like natural language processing properly. Poor Tillman and a set of RAs again went through a lot of these speeches to try to cover topics, and we're like, and the reason we did that is because the OCR is trash. And then we were like, oh, we have to do this in a more sophisticated way. We have to solve the OCR problem first, so we set it aside. I will say that our initial foray into the very low tech topic modeling approach shook out the way you would expect. But again, given the fact that we were just sort of like coding, we didn't want to hang our hats along on that. So we set that aside for the follow-on paper. As for the substantive question, I do think it's not war. I think it is mostly about the outbreak of war, but I also want to acknowledge that for some of these ideological entrepreneurs, victory also provided an opportunity. So there was a lot of shock and trauma that the South decided to right? But it was also the case that these individuals already adhered to an ideal of the United States in which the national government had the robust power to override the interests of the states. Now, this wasn't like some high-minded ideal, right? This really reflected their local political economy interests based on manufacturing in the North, right? To be able to support their industry, they needed a strong national government that was going to push aside the interests of the South that really resisted policies that favor northern manufacturing interests. So the interests do predate the war, but the war provides an opportunity, right? That accompanies the shock of the South seceding. It's like, well, the South is seceded. Like now we have this chance to really do something fighting for this. We might as well fight really, really hard. And so the paper, which I don't have in front of me, has a couple of quotes, I think, that really capture this idea that there is a moment of opportunity. And this moment of opportunity, this feeling of opportunity was reinforced at the time of victory. So now we're going to reconstruct them. Right? So I want to say it's yes to all of your questions, but it's yes, especially the first part of the outbreak of war. Thanks.
Great, thanks. I'm going to go back to the room for a minute, but folks on Zoom, I see your questions. I'll come back to you shortly. Next, over to Sam later. Sam?
Thanks so much for the talk. This was really interesting. I should invest in a notebook, so I'm not carrying a laptop up here. But I had a few questions about sort of the data you showed, and I thought there were a few interesting things about it. One, it looks like the proportion of USS English is close to zero pre-war. Is that like a finding in of itself, something you want to explore or have thoughts about? It also, I thought was interesting that prior to the war, the South is also increasingly accepting the US as a singular. What do you think is going on there? Why is the side that is preparing for secession essentially becoming more close to accepting US as a singular nation. And then lastly, you talked about at the end how Reconstruction, ends up being rejected by the South, but at the end of the period you look at, it appears that the newspapers are overwhelmingly accepting the US as a singular nation. Why do you think there is a disconnect? Is that something where temporally you might see a shift later if you were to extend out the dates? And thank you again for the talk.
Thanks. So the proportion of, so we are not the first scholars to notice that the singular was hardly used at the start of the 19th century. There's a great study by some literary scholars who looked at newspapers, a different set of newspapers than what we look at, without drawing the sectional distinctions, and they have the same finding. This debate about is and are has actually been played out. It has analogs in history and in the digital humanities about sort of whether the Civil War was this transformative moment. It ends up the answer is both. Historians would say, the Civil War eradicated the plural. The literary scholars say this is a much more slow process of transformation. It's both, because the Civil War actually does accelerate the usage of singular for the North. So we're not the first to observe this. It's also been observed in different types of texts. So there's been a study of all Supreme Court opinions since the founding that also traces the slow increase in singular from basically zero. And so that's part of the reason why we don't make too much about that, and we focus much more on the sectional differences and the within section heterogeneity. We also think within sectional heterogeneity is why we see that increase in the South, right? The South, just as the North, was not a monolith. And so even within the South, there was a lot of contestation about slavery, slave interests, the role of states' rights, right? Even on the eve of secession, there was debate among Southerners about whether the South, their states should secede. And we think that that slow upward trend is probably reflecting that within section heterogeneity. There was a version of the plot that like in early versions of this talk, I used to show smooth mentions, not bubble plots, but just like smooth, I think it's like Lois or something, of singular usage by North and South. And what we kind of see there is that the South starts to taper off. We weren't really sure if that was a function of the smoothing algorithms, because we tried different ones and we could still see that tapering. But we think that we need more data like past 1900 to be able to be sure that there is an actual tapering. I don't think I have it in backup slides to show. No, I don't. So, and unfortunately, I inquired with the proprietary database people, and they're like, no, we don't have it past 1900. So I'm going to have to go look somewhere else to really figure out what's going on. I think what it suggests, though, is that it's increasing. There's a flattening of the curve, and then it goes back up, like after some amount of time, as the South. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So my comments largely follow on or are consistent with Rich's. So one question is, what rhetoric does Lincoln use when he's running for election? Are there shifts that appear, say, in the campaign documents in 1864 that might explain some shift? And hints that in terms of the case studies, I'm not sure, I may have missed it, but I can't tell if what you're interpreting as ideological hardening is ideological hardening versus entrepreneurs who are already in favor of this idea using what happened with the war as an opportunity. So that it could simply be, this is instrumental and we were handed an opportunity to do what we wanted to do anyway. So this, I think the case studies could help disentangle how much is really a fundamental shift in ideation versus, hey, if someone hands us an opportunity, we're going to run with it.
Right.
Finally, your quote is from the Washington Post, right? Yeah. So the Washington Post didn't come into being until 1877. So I was intrigued by, after Appomattox, we. So who is the we? Is this the the sovereign we. So who are the we? Who's the we? And why did they decide after Appomattox, which is of course not the start of the war, but close to the end? So it's a very intriguing quote. I'm not sure it quite fits, or not sure it quite fits your argument, or there's a much more complicated story that maybe very much does fit your argument. But I found the quote both very interesting, but also kind of confusing.
Okay. So on the quote, I've always thought of the we as like we Americans, as opposed to we, like the editorial board of the Washington Post.
But it sounded, as described here, it sounded as if you were saying we, the editorial board, decided to do this after. So again, it may have been that I misunderstood.
I might have been
in the context
unclear.
of the paper
Yeah.
not existing until
Yeah.
about the time when
They
they
were-
made the statement. I was having a hard time parsing.
Totally, got it, yeah. What I can tell you is that the editorial was written because, like, specifically because readers had written in being like, the United States are, like, why are you saying the United States is? And so at the beginning of the editorial, they actually acknowledge that this is the reason why they write the editorial. But it never, I have to admit,
It's still very much contested concept.
Exactly.
decades on.
exactly,
Yeah.
right, which I think was reflected in the data too, the fact that there is still quite a bit of plural usage. We also see this in newspapers and in letters written to newspapers elsewhere, right? Where people are like, only these Confederates who were traitors are using these plural these days, right? So it is freighted with meaning. But I take your point that perhaps the Washington Post quote is not the best one to present on this evidence.
It was much, I'm trying to wrap my head around what this quote's supposed to be from.
Yeah, point taken. On the question of what rhetoric does Lincoln use, I'm embarrassed to say that I don't know about is-are, but I can tell you that historians have traced his usage of union and nation, and that he does stop using union or significantly decreases his word union after victory. Right, so after the war breaks out as well. I think McPherson writes about this explicitly in the conclusion of one of his Civil War volumes. But other historians have noticed this as well, that Lincoln will make actually a deliberate rapid switch. I have not actually looked at is-are, so I probably should. Yeah, and then I take your point about ideological hardening and entrepreneurial. What you are describing is what we think of as the difference between those two hypotheses, right? That this sort of opportunistic idea is what corresponds with the entrepreneurs, that they're already committed. And that there's an opportunity that comes with the moment. And the difference for us is that for the valence hypothesis, it should apply to everyone, right? As sort of ordinary individuals, or like non-elites, I should at least say, right? That ordinary individuals who may not sort of be attuned to national politics, right, are suddenly forced to grapple with politics in a way they weren't before, right? And there's analogs to this even today, right, in the studies of American foreign public opinion. Can I have 2 fingers?
2 fingers, yeah.
Just a quick follow-up on that. I was wondering sort of the dichotomy between imagined sovereignty as a popular notion versus finding the actual fact that you're looking at among Congress people who are in fact elites and not sort of showing us what the imagined sovereignty of the popular sentiment is.
Yeah, so there's a couple of caveats there, which I should mention, right? So we're not capturing the speech of women. We're not capturing the speech of Black men, right? Or Black women for that matter, or really any other minorities. We probably do have a couple of newspapers that are circulated for what are then minority populations or immigrant populations, but I should be very careful that this is not popular in the sense of representative of American society, right? There are no women in Congress in this period, so we're not really capturing that. We do think that the newspapers get us closer to the notion of popular speech. That's why we lead. It's part of the reason why we lead with it. I think that also explains the timing of the effects, right? So if you notice, as I was going through those tables really quickly, sometimes we saw levels changes, and sometimes it was changes in the rate of adoption. The level jump happened among the elites, and the change, the slope shift, that appeared in the newspaper. And I actually think that is evidence of the elites leading, right? The ones who are most committed are going to change right away. And then it sort of trickles down into sort of more popular society, or at least the non-elite segment of society. So yes, we use the word popular, and I have not, I think, adequately caveated what we mean by that. So thanks for pointing it out.
Back to the Zoom, over to Volia Turner.
Sorry, you say my name?
Yes.
Okay, yes. Thanks so much, Melissa. This is a fascinating project. And so I have two questions. Feel free to just take up one of them. So first one is along the lines of Richard's suggestion to talk about other linguistic shifts that happened at the time, right? So when I think about the proportion of using United States is to general mentions, I'm also thinking about separating the numerator and denominator. And to me, the very kind of focus on the United States as an entity, either or, whatever the whatever follows, is a sign of thinking about the United States as a whole, right? So I'm curious if you looked at just mentions of the United States as opposed to other possible terms that could be used and how that varies by North and South, because I could see, for example, after the war in the South, maybe the whole like mention of that entity is occurs less frequently. So that's one question. And the second question is, I wonder if more could be done with the geography of newspapers based on what they are. There could be some interesting patterns, particularly places that are near to the South, but are still in the North, or places where the decisive battles were won, or maybe proximity to Washington, or something. The idea is very vague, but I think that perhaps more interesting things could be done with focusing on this local nature of newspapers, particularly because you're focusing on letters to the editor, which are very localized. Thanks.
Yeah. So on the second, my dream was to do an analysis that looked at how mentions vary based on proximity to Sherman's March to the Sea. And to my regret, unfortunately, the newspapers are not clustered in places that would let me do that with any degree of confidence. So I used to have a picture of backup slides that would show you the sort of where the papers were, where the headquarters cities are. So we just don't get that sort of rich county coverage. Did you want to hop in on that point?
Yeah, I think you want to be careful about whether you can do it or not is one thing, but Sherman's march north from the coast to Virginia was much crueler on the population than Sherman's march to the sea. Much crueler and much more destructive. I think all historians agree with this. If you're looking for variation, I think you have to actually focus on how the battles were conducted in the South, how much collateral damage there was in the South. If your mechanism for acceptance is one based on the experience of the war.
Right.
Even the surrender documents after that campaign are quite clear. They just say, look, we're beaten this way, that way, outnumbered, outgunned. The soldiers are mutinying, they're leaving the army. This is the whole Confederate story.
Right.
So it seems like you to figure out whether the mechanism of the war, actual A, the loss, and B, the destruction and pain, is an important variable. It seems to be that. Of course, the problem there is that one of the reasons Sherman was so cruel is because they perceived these states as being the hotbed of insurrection. So there was a big revenge motive, at least historians attribute a big revenge motive to the Union soldiers in that campaign.
Yeah, point taken. The other variant that I was thinking about was basically exposure to battle, because we have that, like that data exists. We don't have it with us, but the data exists. And again, like I take your point that like it sort of captures something different, or the idea is like separate from whether or not we can do it, but it turns out we can't do it, so it's moot. Volia, you asked about mentions of the United States as a whole.
Yeah,
So
just United States as such by itself, as opposed to states without United, or we, or whatever the place names.
Right. I'm so glad you asked me about that, because that is the follow-on paper that we are writing. So what you were referring to is grammatical subject mentions of polities. And from conversations that I've had with some linguists, it turns out that polities did not, it's a relatively modern development that a polity will occupy the grammatical subject position of a sentence, right? That is, it never used to be the case that we would ever say things like Britain did X, or the United States went to war, or Russia invaded Ukraine. Right? It did not, this is a relatively, in the long study of languages, is a relatively recent development. My instinct, perhaps reflecting my bias as a scholar of the state, is that the grammatical subject mentioned, the sort of increasing frequency of that, corresponds to the greater presence of the state in people's lives in sort of an administrative regulatory sense, right? So that I study state presence in sort of a physical sense, but that some of my work is also about sort of increasing regulatory and administrative presence. And I think that probably that is what's driving the increased usage of the grammatical subject. So some of these linguists say that grammatical subject mentions actually reflect animacy, right? That the state is a thing that is animate. And I'm thinking now to sort of the old school comparative politics debates about the autonomy of the state. But also that in some cases, the state even has agency, right? And so in this follow-on paper, we actually want to explore whether it is the case that grammatical subject mentions are in fact reflecting increased sort of state activity. And that's where we really hope to clean up the OCR. Our ambition is to redo a significant amount of the OCR, then apply these much more sophisticated techniques that will identify parts of speech. So I'm glad to hear that there's interest in this.
Sticking in the Zoom, over to you, Aiden.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Melissa. This was a super interesting paper. I kind of have two things, one of which has been brought up a couple of times, so I'll go really fast. I agree it would be really interesting to see if you can kind of look at other ways of talking about the country in order to maybe partial out the grammatical standardization that's happening over the 19th century. The thing that I would say struck me is that I was pretty compelled by the evidence you presented about this discontinuity around the war. And then when you zoom out and look at the plot that goes from 1800 to 1900, it got me thinking two things. One is, well, grammatical standardization of American English is really in its infancy at the start of your time period. And so I don't have strong expectations about what that would mean in terms of the political import of using one or the other way of talking about the United States. And then the other thing that I was thinking is, the politics of language disputes, I wonder how long their shelf life is. So the quote from the Washington Post, I found super compelling to say that this choice had a lot of political meaning at that time. And then I wonder, how long, do you have a sense of when that proxy kind of expires as a good indicator of a person's political beliefs or a person's, opinion about the locus of sovereignty? I would say just my guess is that it doesn't matter so much now, just because the grammar has been so standardized. And so there's some period of time in between 1865 and now when it stops being as much of a political question. And then the last thing is, I would just be really interested to see if these same kind of patterns held up with a totally different grammatical construction, which I realize is a lot of work, but possessive mentions of the nation or the country or the United States or something like that. But yeah, thanks very much. I think this was really cool and a very clever paper.
I really like the idea of possessive mentions. I have to say we didn't think of that one before. So I'm going to flag it, see if there's something to it. The linguistic standardization point, I think, actually speaks to a scope condition question. Right? One of the interesting things about the United States education system is that we don't have a national education system, right? So the national government has much less influence over what is taught in schools compared to other polities, right? So I would say that this is probably this particular kind of way of talking about our polity is not something that will transfer easily to polities where I think the national government can control the content of local education. On the politics of language disputes, I do think they have a shelf life. In this specific case, there's two things going on. So the transformation is complete sometime in the early 20th century. Partly that's just a ceiling effect, right? There's just like relatively few people left who are not using the grammatical plural. Partly that's because the most embittered members of the Confederacy are no longer in Congress or have died, right? So they are gone. And then additionally, the outbreak of World War I, right? Another kind of traumatic event that I think scholars have rightly pointed to affecting how Americans think about themselves as a nation and their place in the world, right? And so I think that for sure puts a shelf life, an expiration date on this particular linguistic transformation. Hard to say what would have happened in the absence of World War I, right? But I do think that ceiling effect suggests that this was going to taper off.
I'm going to start speed dating round. Two folks, so Ayal and Maria, since we're sitting close to each other, I have a question, please. The question was already asked. Oh, okay. Then I will group Maria and Eric. Since you're both relatively close. Jim, you're next with Eric.
No, I should be quick. So this is in part my two finger that I phrased really badly, but I'm really looking at the idea of sovereignty itself, right? And you frame this paper as saying that we can draw this distinction between institutional sovereignty and imagined sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
But the main effect that you show in the data is that the very people who are creating the institutions of sovereignty are the ones for whom this imagined sovereignty effect is happening. So I'm wondering to what extent are you actually showing that there's a separation between the two versus the people for who imagined the nation are the ones who created the nation, and sovereignty is still this united concept.
Right.
Hey, Melissa, thanks so much for sharing this. So my question is actually kind of related to Maria's about kind of elite effects. So I'm wondering if, in a future project, there's any value in actually looking at whether these kind of the grammatical changes are actually reflected in government documents as well, but the state and federal level, because that might let you get at some of this question as to whether the public is leading the elite are kind of leading the public. And then I guess perhaps allows you to integrate some questions about kind of institutional changes and these ideational ones. So less of a question than a comment. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I apologize for misinterpreting your question the first time around. Yes, it's true that the people who are creating the institutions and making policy via those institutions are the ones who are the fastest at imagining a sovereignty of the United States that is whole, that is consolidated and embedded in the national government. But I think if it was only those individuals, then we should not see the changes in the newspapers as well, because the newspapers, again, most of the content is not political. Like having sat there and read a bunch of these myself, I mean, they covered everything from like local crime to, in the case of California, like a really important citrus festival. And as a Californian, citrus is important, so I get it. So like a lot of mundane stuff happening, and they just happen to mention the United States in a completely non-political way, and you do see this change, right? So I think it cannot be reduced to just people who are in positions of power shaping the institutions of sovereignty and imagining the sovereignty in a certain way. If the evidence was only from those individuals, then I would really hesitate to say this is a story about the popular imagination. So I hope that answers the question better this time. And Eric, definitely should try that. I'm trying to think of like if I've seen government documents that use the U.S. in a grammatical subject position in that way. But I don't know. So I'm really eager to go look. Thank you.
The next pair of questions we got Eric Higginbotham and Jim Walsh.
Eric Higginbotham, that was a fascinating talk. Thanks very much. So we've all heard the historian sort of statement that the United States was plural and then became singular after the war. I was struck by three things in your talk. the third and second, maybe most important, the sectional shift and the role of entrepreneurs, which I found compelling. But the most important sort of takeaway for me from this, at least as far as sort of historical observation and trends are concerned, is that the historians are absolutely wrong. You said both the historians and the literary analysts were correct, but my takeaway would be the historians are wrong. The bigger pattern is that there's a long-term, powerful, enduring shift from 1800 to at least 1900 in our treatment of the state that probably has more to do with other things, institutional change in the role of government in people's lives and these other correlates that you mentioned with regard to modernization. So in any case, that's not to say, I mean, you're focused on the effects of the war. So, and there are some, and it's very interesting, but I would want to hear a little bit more about what the other correlates are there as sort of background condition and whether or not you think that characterization is correct. Thanks.
Well, I think it's a fun and interesting and innovative project, and I enjoyed your talk. I want to give one quick reaction and ask one substantive question.
Yeah.
The reaction is an emotional one, so that you're getting sort of an N of one here about how I'm feeling when I'm hearing you talk about it as a communicator. I'm willing to buy that the change in grammar is somehow a good metric for telling us what's happening. I'm open to that and I'm willing to accept it. But the feeling I have is one of wariness, because I feel like there's ever compounding numbers of uncertainties in the method. Now, we all deal with Whitehead saying, the territory, the map is not the territory, but you start with this one grammatical metric. I don't know how good grammatical metrics are in the past at performing for being able to predict these sort of cultural changes. Is it good? Is it bad? It's not 100%, it's X. And then because you're wonderfully transparent, admirably so, about your inferential challenges, each one of those requires a workaround that introduces another element of uncertainty. And I think they start to pile up. That's what I want to believe it, but that's why I'm wary. The comment or the question, where is Reconstruction in all this? Like, I don't know crap about Reconstruction, and all I know is from Foner. I haven't read it in a while, but it doesn't seem like, and maybe I missed it, in the data that's for that 12 years, there is an institutional footprint, even if it's not having ideational effects. Shouldn't that show up somewhere, as we look at the data? And if not, what does that mean? Thanks.
Right. Okay. Let me start with the sort of validity of the measure. I think this is why we're not coming out swinging really hard against the historians, right? So my first instinct was, there is a really long run shift here. And at least some of the historians of the Civil War wrote very confidently about how the war really wiped out this idea of multiple sovereignties. It wiped out the use of union and it wiped out the plural. And I didn't, given all of the concerns that you've just raised, we did not feel like it was appropriate for us to say, well, the historians are wrong. Like we have to, like, clearly we are right and they're wrong. We wanted to be much more circumspect about what we found. Right, and to also acknowledge that there is a bit of debate among historians, right? That the Civil War historians are a little bit different in their perspectives than the ones who take a much more long-run view of American political development in this time period. That's part of the reason why we're like not pushing that view so hard. I think I do stand by this contention that both sides are right? That there is a transformative moment, but that moment did not eradicate the idea of the union, it did not eradicate the grammatical plural. As for grammar, with apologies to Rich, I used to be a skeptic of text analysis. I think like thinking about Rich's work, and then I guess 5, 6, 7 years ago, Rich actually helped come, and he will probably, if he wants to chime in on this, he will remember that I've asked him for help in thinking about how to do text analysis, right? Like sort of, I really actually attribute to my first foray into textual analysis because of a conference that Rich and I were at. Maybe you remember, Rich, I think it was at Harvard. And so I think I've slowly sort of come around to this idea that like we can learn something about how people speak. Being an IR trained person, I was like, oh, speech is just cheap talk. Like, what matters is behavior. And I've really come around to this view that like what we say, how we say it, and to who we say it matters, right? But I wouldn't go as far as saying that grammar, like looking at these kind of shifts is always right. I think it's right in this situation, given the lack of alternative measures, right? We can't go and ask Americans, right? So we're trying to triangulate as best we can what might map on sort of how they might think about sovereignty. And that's why we have this really careful 3-step conceptual validity approach that appeals to authority, that looks at the Confederacy, and that looks at primary source mentions. So, I think for us, particularly the Confederacy evidence is compelling. So we went and did the same exercise looking for grammatical singular and plural mentions of the Confederacy. And that's for us what nailed it, right? That this is mapping onto that concept. But I would not say grammar is always going to be right. Like, as someone who cares deeply about measurement, I just really hesitate to say this is always right and always in all situations. So I also want to believe, I hope that we have been convincing. But again, you mentioned the transparency, and part of the reason we're doing that is so that readers can make their own conclusions. Where is Reconstruction? So I think we might be out of time, but let me just answer this question about Reconstruction. So the South is not, has not been readmitted. So there are no, and once they are, so when they have representation during this period, they are not free to elect their representatives, right? So there is federal troops in the South, and the individuals who represent the Southern states largely reflect the views of the North as victors. So I think in backup slides, we did have a slide that actually brought evidence to bear. But basically, we think the Reconstruction period, particularly for the speech data, cannot be compared in the same way. So we're very, very hesitant to draw conclusions on that period.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
We are out of time. Please join me in thanking.